Hi, today we're going to look at a simple but essential understanding to effectively building and modifying spreadsheets, absolute and relative cell references. If you started Excel with a basic tutorial or have been doing it for a while, you've likely figured this out and this isn't necessary. But if you've kind of muddled along and you're not really understanding it, it is an essential few minutes of your time to learn to understand this and use it effectively. So let's get started. Each cell in a spreadsheet is referenced by its column and row indicator, such as the cell containing the force magnitude here in cell D4. So if I select it, and we look up in the name box up here to the top left, we see that it is referenced as D4. D is the column indicator, 4 is the row indicator. This reference is used by most mathematical functions built within the spreadsheet. If we want to calculate the moment, caused by the indicated moment arm right below it here in cell D5, we can use the references of those two cells to build an equation. So we'll do that right here just below it. So we'll build an equation, start with equals, and by selecting the force, it inserts its cell reference. We'll choose multiply, and then select the length here, cell D5. And when we hit enter, we get the value of that equation. But if we select it and we look back up here into the formula bar, we see that what it's actually doing is it's got the cell references D4 and D5. So if we change the value in one of those, say we change the force to 2000, it will update it because it simply goes back to that cell reference, pulls the current value, and calculates the new value. Let's change that back. Now, in building the equation the way we did, by default, it uses relative cell references. What that means is that it's considering the cell reference relative to its referencing or equation location. In this instance, go back here. Because the cell containing the equation is two cells below the force and in the same column or 0 columns away, then if we were to move this cell, I'm just going to copy it here and paste it over here. And now we were to look at it. It updates the cell references to indicate the cell 2 cells up and 0 columns over. And you can see those highlighted here, H4 and H5. Now, you might wonder why it would do that. Well, this is actually very useful to us in a lot of instances when we're building the spreadsheet, because we do want to look at the cell relative to where we're going. And I'll demonstrate that here just in a second. But first, let's look at what our options are. When I type in the equation this time, I'll use the F4 key to toggle the relative versus absolute options for each cell referenced. So I'm just going to choose equal to the force value to keep it simple. But then before I leave, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the F4 key to toggle whether it is a relative or absolute reference. And if I press F4, you see that it inserts two $signs, one before the column reference and one before the row reference. What the $sign indicates is that that is now looking at cell D4 in the absolute terms. So if I copy and paste this, it will stay looking at D4 no matter where it is. So let's try that. I'm going to hit enter to lock that in. We see it up here, absolute. So now when I copy and paste it and go over here and paste it in, and we look at it, you see it still maintains the value of 1000 because it is looking absolutely at D4. And it doesn't matter where we move it on the spreadsheet, it will continue to look at the very specific cell D4. Now, one thing we should know, if I go in here, go back to my F4 key, is that if I continue to use it to toggle, it will change it, and it'll toggle our way through from both column and row reference being absolute, to just the row reference being absolute, to just the column reference being absolute, and then back to it being a relative reference. And this gives us a lot of control and power when we know we're going to copy and paste that cell. If we're never going to move a cell, none of this really matters. But if we're going to copy and paste that cell, it's going to matter whether we're using an absolute or a relative reference. So I'm going to do something a little bit more adventurous here, is I'm going to copy the equation, and I'm going to use a mix of absolute and relative references so that it does exactly what I want it to do. I'll probably screw it up the first time just to demonstrate why we want to do this. So I'm going to go down here to cell D9 in this table, and really what I want to do is I want to create a whole column of moment calculations at some point X along a beam, for example. And so we've put distances X in the column column C right beside it. And so we want to reference that. We want to reference the force. We want to multiply the two together. So let's do that. So we're going to go equals. We're going to take our force and we're going to multiply it by our distance. And we hit it. And it's great. 100 is exactly what we were expecting. And of course, the easiest way to get that to proliferate itself down the column is to just drag the little box in the bottom right-hand corner and to bring it down. But you see, it doesn't quite work. And it doesn't take too much investigation to figure out why it's not working. Let's go down one cell down below and choose it to highlight what's happening. So when we look at this, it's no longer referencing the force, it's referencing the length up here in D5, and it is correctly referencing the distance, 0.2 meters. So what happened is that both of these cell references are relative, but we need one of them, the one looking at the force, to remain absolute. The force only exists in one spot, but we do want the one looking at the distance along the beam to change. So let's see if we can do that correctly this time. So we're going to go back to our equation. Here it is, d4 times c9, and we want d4, or the reference to d4, to be absolute. So let's use my F4 key. We'll toggle that to be absolute, and we'll press yes. And now, when we drag it down, we get values that seem to make sense, because if we go, say, partway down to the 1.9 meters, we look at our cell, it's still looking at D4 absolutely, and relatively, it has updated itself to be looking at the cell C27 to pull its distance off. So I'm going to do this one more time just to show how we can be a little bit more precise so that in the instance that our spreadsheet, when we're building it, requires that precision. So I'm going to go over here. In this case, we've done the same data table, but it's going to be horizontal. So I'm going to build my equation down here in I14, go equal to our force. I'm going to toggle the force with my F4 key as absolute. Then I'm going to choose multiply, and I'm going to choose my distance. If for some reason I wanted to be a little bit more precise with the distance, I know that I want the column reference to update, but the row reference is going to stay the same. So I could choose to have the column, oh no, I got that backwards. I could choose to have the row stay the same, but the column reference update, hit equals, and when I copy this horizontally, this should, if I got it right, all work. And it does seem to do that here. So I can't go over all of the instances where you want to fiddle with this, but understanding the difference between the relative and the absolute and the ability to split between column and row on one of those references becomes really important. The F4 key, can't forget that one. You'll be using it a lot. So hopefully this is helpful and you'll be able to make your spreadsheets a little bit more intuitively as you move forward.